Hello, hello, hello. This is another data dive into the 2020 census information available through the United States government's United census data. You can find it at something like census.us.gov, or I don't know the exact handle for it, but it will be in this video's description for you to click on. Before you is some data interpretation I did about each states and territories, of which the US has 56, uh, breakdowns by age and sex. And since the current US administration only considers two sexes, I'm just gonna stick to that for the sake of this video and for the sake of data consistency. Not that we like that, but it's more fair. And if we're even just playing by these fair rules and these raw numbers, some things have got to change. All right, this map is a little bit exaggerated based on rounding, but I do it to prove a point. It's from this data, which I show here, which is sourced from our 2020 United States Census. I break down the percentages of each state's and territories' children, as in 7, they say 18 and below. That's what the census is. 18, 0 to 18 is what the census shows. So in this number, 18-year-olds are considered children, which, some states, depending on the jurisdiction, will consider children 17 and younger. Some states 18 and young. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just saying this is how numbers work when you do things like determine an age as 17 or 18 and how that can change things. So this is 18 and below percentage, okay? This is retired is 65 and over. It doesn't mean they're actually all retired. My parents are in their 70s and supposedly have retired, but both actually have jobs. Huh. And then this is percentage of the state being female or women, but technically women are adult females. Anyway, women is having a gender word, not a sex word, but anyway, that's other stuff that this video doesn't really dive into. But this simplifies the data into ways that we can at least think about it. People who are 65 and older, people who are 18 and younger, people who are assigned at birth as female, and at this point identify as such on their government identifications, and therefore marked, we assume, therefore marked as such on the US Census. I didn't look deeply enough to see if there was a gap in like who was female, who was male, if there was like a percentage per state of people who called themselves gender nonconforming or trans or just non-gendered at that time in the 2020 census. I don't know if the census included that option, but I know that at least I chose percentage female to show, something. It shows something, okay? I chose colors to be a little bit easy to represent. So green for children, lots of youth life. Gold, that's what I chose for the older folks, 65 and older, right? And I chose this is like supposed to be pink. That's supposed to be it. For females, women, whatever. Who knows? And then over here, I tried to choose more. Well, this bar in the general population just shows the ranking of like the comparison of each state's population to each other, and how some states have very, very, very small population in comparison to like California, right? Almost 40 million people live in California itself, right? 12% of the USA lives in California. Okay, more than 1 in 10 Americans are Californians. Done. Okay, it is true that almost 30 million Americans live in Texas, which is, I think, that's 9%, a little bit less than 1 in 10 Americans is a Texan. So that's how this map is shown. I did it in 2 other videos. I used this map. I dive into demographics and deeper into ethnic data, which I used these graphs to talk about charts, changes. But anyway, in the previous videos, I determined what percentage each state would have if I made America into just 100 squares. Like if America had 100 squares, which places would have, like each square represents 1% of the American population. Does that make sense? And these circles, they do not consist 1% at least of the American population. So Puerto Rico consists of 1%, like 1% of Americans who are American citizens are Puerto Ricans. Right? 1% of Americans are West Virginians. You see that? 1% of Americans are Connecticuters. I don't know what you say with someone from Connecticut. 4% of Americans are from the state of Illinois. That's how that goes. 6% of Americans are from Florida. See, 6% of Americans are from New York. See that? So that's how that went. Then, when I was thinking about like representation, because people younger than 18 don't vote, so that's how you can interpret this. So these people don't really have an ability to represent themselves in our government. So this is the percentage of each state that does not have the ability to vote. And this is the percentage of the state that we can almost rely on voting consistently. But no state has a majority of people as either children or retirees, as in 65 and older. But there are states that have a majority of people, as in like 51% of the state are females. People who identify as females on a census. In fact, the Puerto Rico, this state here, territory, forgive me, almost has 53% of Puerto Rico being women or identifying as a female. DC, again, almost 53% of DC is women or female, right? So, if you're looking for, if you are a woman who dates women or a man who dates women, that's not me. Then, maybe those are places you want to go for a special somebody. District of Columbia or Puerto Rico, Alabama also. Almost 52% of Alabama identifies as women or females, right? So I look at this data, and then if the percentage rounds to 51%, that means 50.5 and higher, I gave the state's name pink. If the state was 49.4% women or less, I gave the state's name a blue background to mean that there are more men than women or more males, people who identify as males on a census, and there are people who identify as females on a census in that state. So Alaska, American Samoa, Colorado, Guam, Montana, North Dakota, Northern Mariana Islands, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. So, it's a very select number of states that have more men or people who identify as males than people who identify as females. And these gray states, that's where the percentage is between 49.5 and 50.5. So that it's like, in my mind, it's a balance. In Arizona, California and Hawaii, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Minnesota, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, Vermont, Washington, West Virginia, and Wisconsin all have pretty good balance of gender or sex in their populations, right? If you're looking for men, as in partners to be men, maybe the best place for you to look is the Northern Mariana Islands, uh, less than like uh, what's this? Almost 53% of the Northern Mariana Islands is men. Wonder why a military base is there, right? If you look at Alaska, it's the state with the most men. Again, almost 53% of Alaska is men. Wonder why? Oh, the mining, oil, and fishing industries, right? So think about that. Colorado is probably the state that has the most like democratic lean to it, right? If you think about it, that is still a male or man majority state. Almost 52% of Colorado is people who identify as men. So I guess for those of us who are queer or progressive men, that's kind of the place, I guess, for us, right? Colorado. Now, when I took this map, I did some exaggerating. So you know, if a state has four, in theory, every state should be roughly half and half, either pink and blue. But for states where I wanted to just show that there is this lean, I chose to give, like Colorado, made it all blue. Not because it's actually all blue, but because it's 52% man in Colorado. I just put it as all blue just to be exaggerated, just to really show these exaggerations, right? Florida is still mostly women. And I think with this map, I then kind of then pushed to say, like, why isn't there, like, if 51, almost 52% of the United States population is women, then why aren't 51, almost 52 senators of the United States Senate women, right? Why aren't like 26 governors women, right? Why aren't more than half of elected officials women, right? That's what I'm asking about. So if you look at these numbers, I then go into the states with the most children. So those are states that are growing fast. States with the most retirees or elderly folks. That's the states that are probably going to have the most debt, right? They're going to have a lot of wealth, but it's not going to be wealth that produces wealth. It's going to be wealth that like invests and wealth that like buys stocks and stuff like that, takes social security checks. So you got to think about that's to be a different type of, neither of these populations do a lot of working, but both do a lot like this, do a lot of eating, this do a lot of taking of retirement funding. And then obviously, like, if you think about, you know, people who are assigned as female at birth are the ones who biologically can produce other humans, but they doesn't mean they do or want to or will. So these are all things that we are, talk about when we talk about these population numbers. Also, percentages don't mean actual raw population. Like, even though California is pretty 50-50 split between people who identify as males and people who identify as females, the population of women is still the largest in the country, of almost 20 million people identifying as women living in California, right? And there are almost 15 million people identifying as women living in Texas. So again, we're going to look at like the place with the highest percentage of women, people identifying as women, is Puerto Rico, then DC, then Delaware, Mississippi, then Alabama. Like those are the top 5 percentage. Like women should have an outright majority of power in those 5 places in Puerto Rico, DC, Delaware, Mississippi, and Alabama. And those should be places where like women have a grip on power. I'll just say that. But where women would have like the most like actual numbers, where people would be able to like, I'm looking to partner with a woman because I'm a lesbian or a bisexual or a straight man or something like that. Then you would go to California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania, because that's the most numbers of physical like women. But if you want to be like a woman who's like not bound by men, like you probably would be like going to Puerto Rico or DC or Delaware or Mississippi or Alabama in theory, you know. If you're an elderly person, Puerto Rico, Maine, Vermont, West Virginia, and Florida are the top five per percentages elderly. But for again, number of people who are actually elderly, California, Florida, Texas, New York, Pennsylvania. Okay? If you are a child, which states have the most children percentage wise? American Samoa. It's the top three are territories. Maybe that's why, you know, military people making babies. Anyway, American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, right? And then Utah, Texas, right? Military bases are there. Also, states that are very religiously conservative, and therefore, because of those conservative religions, they encourage lots of large families that, you know, yeah. But again, it doesn't mean it up ends the whole trend though. Population wise, still the largest amount of children in the nation is California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, right? I put this bracket over here of just the top 10 states for population so you can see that which brackets kind of upend. Like number of children changes the top 10 only by Illinois and Pennsylvania, with Illinois having slightly more children physically than Pennsylvania. If you look at percentage wise, like none of these 10 are even in this bracket of top 10 for percentage of children. And only like, okay, Utah, Texas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Oklahoma, um, Alaska, and Idaho, you know. Again, it kind of paints the picture of like, okay, this is like a state where there are mostly men, and the women there are having lots of kids, from those men, and paints the picture of like a military state, oil extraction state, etc. People out of retirees. So again, Puerto Rico, Maine, Vermont, West Virginia, Florida, Delaware, Hawaii, New Hampshire, U.S. Virgin Islands, Montana. It makes sense that if there are a lot of people who are retiring, then maybe there are a lot of people who are also women in U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico because, biologically speaking, women live longer than men. Anyway, this has been my data dive into this places with the least women, percentage-wise and numbers-wise. So percentage-wise, Northern Mariana Islands, then Alaska, then North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, Guam, American Samoa, Utah, Montana, Colorado, you know, and then actual numbers. So again, this is going to change. So percentage-wise, Delaware has a high percentage of women, but because Delaware is a small state overall, it's actually the 41st for number of actual women like in the state. So that's like something that kind of is interesting. And then South Dakota, North Dakota, DC again, another one. Mostly percentage is women, but the actual number of women is low. Alaska, Vermont, again, another state that has a high, it's you don't think of it being like a manly state, but it's a low percentage of a low physical number of women because like there are only like 700,000 people in the entire state of Vermont. Guam, Virgin Islands, American Samoa. So those are all territories, which means there are military bases there, which means that's why there's a very large number of men, because even to today, in 2026, the U.S. military is not half men, half women. Just gonna say. Nor is our government, nor is much of anything, though women own 51% of this country. Why don't they have 51% of the power?